I knew the day was going to go sideways the moment I heard plastic scraping against gravel and looked out my kitchen window to see a neat little line of bright orange traffic cones marching straight across my driveway like they owned the place, and behind them stood Karen with her arms crossed and a smile that said she had been waiting for this moment all week, because at that exact second my phone buzzed with a work alert telling me I had 15 minutes to get on the road for a meeting I absolutely could not miss, and there she was blocking the only exit from my property, as if my driveway were a stage, and she was the star of a one-woman show about power and control. And I laughed at first because it felt too ridiculous to be real, but then she lifted a clipboard like a badge of authority and mouthed the words, "You are not going anywhere," and something in my chest tightened as the humor drained out of the situation and left behind that familiar sinking feeling you get when you realize someone has decided to make your life difficult just because they can. And as I stepped outside, I could already feel the eyes of neighbors peeking through blinds and phone cameras hovering behind curtains ready to catch whatever happened next, because nothing attracts an audience faster than public conflict, and Karen loved an audience, and she began loudly explaining that the HOA had decided my driveway was being used improperly, even though I had owned this place for years and the driveway had existed longer than half the houses in the neighborhood, and she spoke in that syrupy authoritative tone that made every sentence sound like a verdict. And when I asked her calmly what rule I was breaking, she tapped one of the cones with her foot and said, "Temporary access restriction pending review," as if saying it slowly would magically make it real. And I remember thinking how absurd it was that a few hollow pieces of plastic were suddenly being treated like an immovable wall, because at the end of the driveway sat my 4x4, still dusty from the weekend trail run, engine cold but capable and patient, and I could feel the contrast between what she thought she controlled and what I actually owned. And she kept talking about fines and notices and compliance, but the more she talked the more it became clear this wasn't about rules, it was about winning. And when I pointed out that she was trespassing, she laughed and said, "Common area oversight." And I almost admired the confidence, because it takes a special kind of nerve to stand on someone else's land and tell them they have no authority there. And by then 2 neighbors had wandered closer, pretending to walk dogs that didn't need walking, and I caught a few phones raised just high enough to record. And Karen noticed too, because she straightened up and raised her voice another notch and announced that the HOA would tow any vehicle that attempted to cross the cones. And that was the moment when the situation tipped from annoying to serious, because threatening to tow a vehicle from private property is not just posturing, it's a line. And I asked her if she had called a tow company, and she smiled wider and said not yet, and something about that smile told me she was hoping I would make a scene so she could play the victim. And I took a breath and reminded myself that losing your temper is how people like her win, and instead I asked her to put in writing that the HOA was blocking my driveway, and she hesitated just a second too long before saying notices would be issued later, which was as close to an admission as I needed. And I could feel the weight of the moment pressing in, because every option carried consequences. Either I backed down and let her set a precedent, or I challenged her and escalated things in front of an audience. And as I stood there, the irony hit me that she had chosen traffic cones of all things, flimsy, light, easily moved symbols of authority rather than actual authority, and she was standing between me and my responsibilities, acting like she was doing me a favor by teaching me a lesson. And when I finally said, "This driveway is mine," she replied, "Not today," and the audacity of it almost made me laugh again. But this time the laughter stayed inside and hardened into resolve, because I knew something she didn't, which was that every inch of this driveway had been surveyed, documented, and defended long before she ever decided to make it her personal battlefield. And as she continued lecturing me about community harmony, I walked past her slowly to my truck, and she stepped forward holding up a hand like a crossing guard, and said, "Stop," and for a split second time seemed to pause, because that single word carried so much weight, control, defiance, spectacle, and every eye was locked on what would happen next. And I could hear my own heartbeat louder than her voice, and I realized this wasn't just about getting to work, it was about whether I would allow someone who thrived on intimidation to rewrite reality in broad daylight. And as I reached the driver's side door, I saw her expression shift from smug confidence to uncertainty, because she had expected me to argue, not act, and she started shouting about consequences and fines and meetings, but her voice wavered, and that told me everything I needed to know about how much real power she had, which was none. And as I sat in the driver's seat and closed the door, the world outside the cab felt suddenly smaller and quieter, like I had stepped into my own space again. And I started the engine, and the low rumble cut through her words, and heads turned and phones steadied, and Karen backed up a step, still talking, still posturing, but now reacting instead of directing. And in that moment I wasn't thinking about crushing cones or proving a point yet. I was thinking about how quickly entitlement collapses when it meets reality, and how this was only the beginning, because if she was willing to block my driveway with plastic cones in front of witnesses, then she was capable of far worse when no one was watching. And as I eased the truck forward just enough to make my intention clear, I caught her eyes and saw something flash there, fear maybe, or disbelief, and I knew then that this wasn't going to be a simple neighborhood spat. It was going to turn into a full-scale war over control, pride, and consequences, and whatever happened next would ripple through the HOA like a shockwave, because Karen had picked the wrong driveway on the wrong morning, and she was about to learn that authority borrowed from a clipboard doesn't stand up well against truth, ownership, and a 4x4 that doesn't ask permission to exist. By the time I rolled forward just enough for the bumper to kiss the edge of the first cone, I could feel the tension snap like a rubber band, and Karen immediately shifted tactics, stepping sideways and planting herself in front of the truck with her palms out as if she were about to stop a moving train, and shouting about safety violations and reckless behavior loud enough for the neighbors to hear, because volume was always her substitute for authority. And I shut the engine off again, not because she had scared me, but because I wanted every word that came next to be heard clearly and recorded accurately. And I told her calmly that standing in front of a vehicle on private property was dangerous, and that she needed to move. And instead of responding like a rational adult, she started talking over me, repeating HOA policy phrases she had memorized without understanding, and throwing in words like liability and enforcement as if they were magic spells. And the longer she spoke, the more I noticed small cracks in the performance, the way she kept glancing at the phones pointed in her direction, the way her hands trembled just slightly when someone asked her from the sidewalk whether she was allowed to do this, and she snapped at them that it was none of their business, which only made them more interested. And one neighbor quietly said, "I thought that was his driveway," and Karen whipped her head around and snapped, "It is under HOA jurisdiction today." And that single word, "today," stuck with me, because it revealed the truth that even she knew this was temporary theater, not law. And I stepped out of the truck and asked her again to move the cones so I could leave, and she leaned in close enough for me to smell her perfume, and told me that if I touched HOA property she would fine me and tow my vehicle and escalate this to the board. And I replied that the cones were not HOA property, and neither was my driveway, and that if she did not move them I would document the obstruction and contact the police for unlawful interference. And that was the first time her eyes widened, because people like her rely on the assumption that others will not call their bluff, and the word police changed the script. And she quickly recovered, saying she would be happy to involve law enforcement, and that she had nothing to hide. And she pulled out her phone, dramatically dialing someone but never actually pressing call, while continuing to narrate the situation for the crowd, painting herself as the calm enforcer dealing with a hostile homeowner. And I could hear the shift in her tone as she tried to frame me as aggressive, even though I had not raised my voice once. And I realized then that this was not just a driveway issue, it was a public trial, and she wanted to control the story. And so I took my own phone out and began recording, openly announcing the date, time, and location, and stating clearly that my driveway was being blocked by a private individual without legal authority, and that immediate access was being denied. And the effect was instant, because Karen froze mid-sentence and demanded to know why I was filming, and I replied that transparency protects everyone. And she sputtered about consent, which made a couple of neighbors laugh quietly, because she had no problem being filmed when she thought it benefited her. And as the crowd grew a little larger, with people pretending to check mail or walk by slowly, the pressure mounted, and Karen began to lose her composure, snapping at people who questioned her and telling one man to stop recording her property, which was ironic, because she was standing on mine, and when I pointed that out she accused me of being disrespectful to the community, and said she had received multiple complaints about my driveway usage, which was news to me, and when I asked her to name one she refused, saying confidentiality, and at that moment I understood that she had expected this confrontation to be quick and decisive, and instead it was dragging on and exposing her lack of preparation, and she started repeating herself, looping back to the same talking points, and the repetition made her sound less convincing each time, and finally she announced that the driveway was being temporarily closed for inspection due to safety concerns, and I asked what safety concerns, and she gestured vaguely at the gravel, and said it was a hazard, and I looked around at the perfectly stable, well-maintained surface that emergency vehicles had used without issue, and I asked her if she had an inspection report, and she said it was pending, and the neighbors murmured, and one woman said you can't just block someone's driveway without paperwork, and Karen snapped that she absolutely could, and that the HOA had broad authority, and that was when I said something that shifted the room. I told her that I had already pulled the county records showing the driveway was deeded as a private access easement solely under my ownership, and that the HOA had no jurisdiction over it. And I said it clearly and calmly so the recording would capture it, and Karen laughed too loudly and said paperwork could be wrong and that the HOA lawyer would sort it out later, and I replied that until then blocking it was illegal, and she scoffed and said sue us then, and that arrogance told me she believed no one would challenge her beyond words, and that belief was her weakness because I had already decided that this was not going to end with me backing down, and as the minutes ticked by my missed meeting became irrelevant compared to the principle at stake, and I could feel my patience hardening into resolve, and I told her that if the cones were not moved immediately I would proceed, and she shouted that I was threatening her, and stepped back theatrically clutching her clipboard, and several phones zoomed in, and someone whispered this is crazy, and I realized that the longer this went on the worse it looked for her, not me, and she sensed it too, because she suddenly announced she would give me a final warning and counted down from 5 like a schoolyard monitor, and when she reached 1 she stood there waiting for something to happen, and nothing did, and the silence that followed was louder than any shouting, and she filled it by declaring that she would file an incident report, and stormed a few steps away, still not moving the cones, and that was when I knew she had overplayed her hand, because she had tried authority, threats, intimidation, and performance, and none of it had worked. And now she was stuck, because backing down would mean losing face and escalating would mean consequences, and I stood there watching her argue with a neighbor who questioned her right to be there, and I thought about how quickly a simple driveway had turned into a test of power and ego, and how this was only the second chapter of a conflict that was clearly going to get much worse before it got better, because Karen was not the type to accept defeat quietly, and if she could not win by blocking my driveway she would try something else, something bigger, louder, and more destructive, and as she finally gathered her cones back into a crooked line, rather than removing them entirely, I understood that this was her way of saying the fight was not over, and she walked away promising fines, meetings, and repercussions, and I watched her go knowing that the real battle was just beginning, and that next time she would not come with plastic cones, she would come with paperwork, threats, and allies, and I would need to be ready for all of it. The letter arrived the next morning, slid halfway under my door like a dare printed on cheap paper with official-sounding language, and a return address that screamed HOA authority, and before I even finished my coffee I knew Karen had worked late crafting it, because it accused me of noncompliance, obstruction, hostile behavior, and unauthorized vehicle use, and demanded immediate payment of fines that somehow totaled more than my monthly mortgage, and gave me 48 hours to comply or face enforcement actions, including towing and legal escalation, and I laughed out loud at first because the absurdity was impressive, but the laughter faded as I realized how deliberately it was written to intimidate anyone who didn't know better, and the timing told me this wasn't coincidence, it was retaliation, and as I read it again slowly I noticed the careful vagueness, no cited rule numbers, no references to governing documents, just threats wrapped in formal language, and I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, not fear but focus, because people like Karen rely on people folding at this stage, and I wasn't going to be one of them. And instead of reacting emotionally, I pulled out my folder, the one I keep for things I hope never to need, and inside were the survey maps, the deed, the easement documentation, and correspondence from years ago, when the developer had tried to blur boundaries and lost. And as I spread them across the kitchen table, I felt the calm that comes from preparation, and by mid-morning I had drafted a response measured, factual, and firm, denying every allegation, requesting proof of jurisdiction, and warning that further interference would be documented and escalated, and I sent it certified because paper trails matter, and I knew she would hate that. And sure enough, by afternoon my phone buzzed with a notification from the neighborhood group chat, where Karen had posted a long dramatic message about dealing with a hostile homeowner who endangered community safety and refused to follow rules. And she didn't name me, but she didn't have to, because everyone knew, and the comments were split, some applauding her for standing up to noncompliance, others questioning her authority, and one neighbor even posted a screenshot of the county map showing my driveway clearly outside HOA boundaries, and that single image shifted the tone instantly, because facts have a way of ruining narratives. And Karen responded, furiously accusing people of misinformation and threatening moderation. And by the time I got home from work, the tension was thick enough to taste, because several neighbors stopped me to ask what was really going on, and I told them calmly exactly what had happened, and showed them the documents, and watched skepticism turn into disbelief, and then into quiet support. And that support mattered, because Karen thrived in isolation, where she could corner people individually and overwhelm them, but in daylight, with witnesses, her power weakened. And that evening I found 2 more letters taped to my door, one labeled Final Notice, and the other Notice of Tow Authorization, complete with a blurry photo of my truck taken from the street. And that was the moment the situation crossed from harassment into something more serious, because threatening to tow a vehicle from private property without authority is not just overreach, it's actionable. And I called the non-emergency police line, not to escalate emotionally, but to document. And the officer who arrived listened, patiently reviewed the paperwork, and shook his head, and said, this looks like a civil dispute, but blocking access and threatening tow without jurisdiction is not okay. And he gave me a case number, and that case number felt like armor. And the next morning, when I left for work, I saw a tow truck idling at the end of the street, and Karen standing beside it, gesturing animatedly. And for a split second my stomach dropped, because even when you're right, the sight of heavy equipment pointed at your property can rattle you. But then the driver approached me holding a clipboard and asked if this was my driveway, and I said yes, and he said the HOA authorized a tow, and I asked him politely to wait while I retrieved documentation. And Karen marched over, smirking, already performing for the imaginary audience, and announced that enforcement had arrived, and that I should have complied when I had the chance. And I handed the tow driver the survey and deed, and he frowned, flipped through them, and stepped aside to make a call. And Karen continued talking louder, filling the silence with threats about fines and liens and legal action, until the driver returned and said he couldn't tow without risking his license, because the paperwork didn't give the HOA authority over this driveway. And Karen exploded, accusing him of incompetence and threatening to report him, and he calmly said go ahead, and started his truck to leave. And that moment was pure electricity, because neighbors had gathered, phones out, and Karen was left standing there, red-faced, clutching her clipboard as the tow truck drove away. And she tried to salvage the moment by declaring that this was not over, and that the HOA lawyer would handle it. And I replied calmly that I looked forward to speaking with them. And that was when she leaned in and hissed that she would make my life miserable. And there was something chilling about how quiet she said it, because it wasn't performance, it was promise. And for the first time I saw the depth of her obsession, because this was no longer about cones or rules, it was about control and humiliation, and she could not stand losing in public. And that realization shifted my strategy, because dealing with someone like that requires not just facts but anticipation. And over the next few days the pressure increased. Anonymous complaints about noise, about parking, about aesthetics, all filed against me, all flimsy, all traceable to the same source. And I documented every one and responded with precision. And as The HOA board scheduled an emergency meeting. Karen began canvassing neighbors, lobbying, spinning stories, trying to recruit allies, and I watched it all from a distance because the more she worked the more mistakes she made, and when the meeting notice arrived announcing a vote on enforcement actions related to my property, I smiled, because she had finally done what I needed her to do, which was put everything on record, and as I prepared my documents and witnesses I knew that this was no longer a private feud. It was going to become a public reckoning, and that by trying to crush me with authority she didn't have. Karen had exposed herself to scrutiny she could not control, and the driveway that she had tried to block with cones was about to become the path through which her own authority would unravel completely. The HOA meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening at the community center, and by the time I arrived the parking lot was already half full, which told me Karen had done her usual round of dramatic invitations and warnings, because nothing motivates attendance like the promise of conflict, and as I walked in I could feel eyes following me, some curious, some cautious, some openly sympathetic, and Karen was already at the front, arranging papers and whispering to two board members with the practice urgency of someone who wanted to appear indispensable, and when she saw me she stiffened just slightly before pasting on a tight smile that never reached her eyes, and the meeting began with routine items that dragged on longer than necessary because Karen kept interrupting to add commentary and frame herself as the guardian of order, and I sat quietly taking notes, letting the tension build, because patience unsettles people like her more than confrontation ever could. And when the agenda finally reached the item labeled driveway enforcement, she stood up without being recognized and launched into a rehearsed speech about community safety, defiance, and disrespect, never once saying my name but glancing at me after every sentence and holding up photos of cones, my truck, and screenshots from the group chat, as if quantity could replace relevance, and the board members nodded along uncertainly, clearly unprepared for the intensity. And when she finished she concluded by demanding immediate enforcement, authority, fines and restrictions, and said the community deserved protection from rogue homeowners, and that was my cue. And when the chair recognized me I stood calmly and introduced myself, and thanked the board for the opportunity to clarify the matter, and the shift in tone was immediate, because contrast is powerful, and I laid out the timeline fact by fact without emotion, starting with the age of the driveway, the recorded easement, the survey, and the previous correspondence with the developer. And as I placed copies of the documents on the table and passed them down the line, I watched confusion turn into concern, and Karen interrupted repeatedly, trying to dismiss the paperwork as outdated or misinterpreted, and each time the chair asked her to wait, and the more she was told to wait the more agitated she became, and when I reached the part about the attempted tow I saw a few eyebrows lift, because that was not a small thing, and I explained that a licensed tow operator had refused the request due to lack of jurisdiction, and that I had a police case number documenting the obstruction and threats, and that was when the room changed, because authority shifted away from performance and toward accountability, and one board member asked Karen if she had verified jurisdiction before authorizing enforcement, and she hesitated and said the HOA had broad discretion, and another member asked if the lawyer had reviewed the action, and she said it was pending, and those two words hung in the air like smoke, because pending is not the same as approved, and I could feel the momentum turning, and when I finished I stated clearly that I welcomed lawful cooperation but would not tolerate harassment or obstruction, and that further attempts would be met with formal complaints and legal remedies, and I sat down, and the silence that followed was heavy, because no one likes realizing they have been misled, and Karen tried to reclaim control by accusing me of intimidation, and said my truck posed a threat to children, and that the cones were a reasonable safety measure, and I responded calmly that blocking a private driveway without authority is not safety, it is trespass, and that if safety were the concern there were proper channels and approvals which had not been pursued, and one neighbor stood up unexpectedly and said they had witnessed Karen placing the cones herself without any inspection, and another neighbor added that emergency vehicles had used the driveway before. without issue, and suddenly Karen was no longer the only voice in the room, and that is when things began to unravel for her, because she had built her power on the assumption of silence, and now the silence was gone, and as more people spoke up questioning her methods and motives, her composure cracked, and she snapped back, defensively contradicting herself, and at one point claimed the driveway was common property before correcting herself and saying it was effectively common, and the board chair finally stopped her and asked for clarity, and she could not provide it, and the chair announced that enforcement actions would be paused pending legal review, and that no further interference would occur, and Karen protested loudly, but the decision stood, and I felt a quiet satisfaction, not triumph, but relief, because process had finally replaced theater, and as the meeting adjourned, Karen stormed out, brushing past me, and hissing that this was not over, and I believed her, because people like her do not retreat, they regroup, and in the days that followed she began a new tactic, quieter but more invasive. Suddenly my trash cans were reported for placement, my lawn for height, my exterior light for brightness, all minor things twisted into violations, and I complied with each one, meticulously documenting responses, because I understood now that she was trying to bury me in paperwork and frustration, and I also noticed her watching from across the street whenever I came or went, taking notes on a clipboard that seemed permanently attached to her arm, and the sense of being observed was unsettling, but it also strengthened my resolve, because intimidation only works when you let it, and I did not. And then one evening, as I pulled into my driveway after dark, my headlights caught something that made my stomach drop, because stretched across the gravel between two posts was a length of rope low enough to be invisible until the last second, and I slammed the brakes and got out, heart pounding, and there was Karen standing near her porch pretending to check her phone, and when I confronted her she said she had no idea what I was talking about and suggested maybe kids had done it, and that moment chilled me because it crossed into physical danger, and I photographed everything, removed the rope, and called the police, and when the officer arrived, he took it seriously because obstructions at night are not pranks, and as he spoke with neighbors, Karen hovered within earshot, trying to insert herself into the conversation, and the officer finally told her to step back, and that small command struck her like a slap, because she was used to being obeyed, and when he gave me another case number and advised me to install cameras, I realized this conflict had reached a new level, because it was no longer just about ego or authority, it was about safety and obsession, and as I lay awake that night listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood, I understood that Karen had gone too far, and that by doing so, she had given me something far more powerful than documents or witnesses. She had given me undeniable proof that her behavior was not just inappropriate but dangerous, and that realization hardened into a plan, because if she wanted a war of control, she had just exposed herself to consequences she could no longer escape, and the driveway she tried so hard to dominate had become the line she crossed that would ultimately bring everything down around her. The cameras went up quietly over the next few days, small unobtrusive units angled to cover the driveway entrance, the rope area, and the street approach, and I did not announce them because there was no need to provoke further, and the effect was immediate because Karen noticed everything, and the moment she realized she was being watched, her behavior shifted from overt confrontation to calculated performance, and that change was almost more unsettling because it meant she was thinking and planning. And within a week the HOA lawyer finally reached out, not with apologies but with a carefully worded request for documentation and clarification, and I provided everything promptly because sunlight is the enemy of manipulation, and as that process unfolded, Karen began spreading a new narrative, one that painted her as the victim of harassment, intimidation, and surveillance, and she told anyone who would listen that my cameras were invasive and threatening, and she even filed a complaint claiming they violated HOA privacy rules, and that complaint landed on my desk with a familiar sense of irony because the same person who had blocked my driveway and threatened towing was now concerned about boundaries, and I responded by providing the camera angles, footage samples, and a statement from the police confirming their recommendation, and the complaint quietly died, but not before Karen used it to rally a few remaining allies who were already inclined to side with authority over facts, and the Neighborhood felt divided in subtle ways. Smiles that used to be easy became cautious, conversations hushed and glances exchanged, and I could feel the social cost of standing my ground, but I also noticed something else. The more Karen pushed, the more people pulled away from her, because exhaustion is a powerful force and entitlement is tiring to witness. And one evening, as I reviewed footage, I saw something that made my pulse spike, because Karen was captured clearly approaching the driveway late at night holding something in her hand, and she hesitated, looked around, and then stepped closer, and the camera caught everything: the hesitation, the glance, the intent, and when she noticed the faint red light she froze and backed away quickly, and that single clip changed everything, because it was no longer my word against hers, it was objective evidence of continued interference, and I sent the clip to the HOA lawyer with a simple note asking for explanation, and the response was silence for 2 days, followed by a sudden change in tone, because the next message acknowledged concerns and requested a meeting, and that meeting took place at a neutral office with the board present and Karen included reluctantly, and I arrived prepared, calm, and focused, and as the footage played on the screen the room grew quiet, because there is something about seeing behavior stripped of excuses that makes denial difficult, and Karen tried to explain it away, saying she was checking for hazards and that she was concerned about safety, but the timestamps and context made that explanation thin, and the lawyer asked her directly whether she had been instructed to conduct inspections at night, and she could not answer, and that was when the board members began to understand the gravity of what they had allowed, and one of them asked why enforcement had been pursued without verification, and another asked why personal confrontations had occurred instead of formal notices, and Karen attempted to deflect blame, but the pattern was too clear, and when the meeting ended the lawyer informed us that an internal review would be conducted, and that all enforcement actions related to my property were suspended indefinitely, and that statement should have been the end of it, but Karen was not done, because people who lose power rarely accept it quietly, and over the next few days she escalated in a different direction by calling city code enforcement, claiming drainage issues, noise violations, and illegal modifications. And each visit ended the same way, with inspectors finding nothing wrong and filing notes that my property was in compliance, and those notes began to pile up, creating a record that painted a picture of harassment, and one inspector even told me off the record that my address had been flagged unusually often and advised me to keep documenting, and then came the moment that shifted the conflict from administrative to unavoidable. Because one afternoon, as I was leaving for work, my 4x4 rolled forward, and the front tire hit something solid that should not have been there, and I stopped immediately, got out, and found a thick piece of wood with nails driven through it placed deliberately at the driveway edge, and my heart pounded as I realized how close that could have come to causing a serious accident, and the cameras had captured the placement clearly, because there was Karen again, hood up, gloves on, placing it carefully and stepping back to check alignment, and when I saw that footage any remaining doubt evaporated, because this was no longer petty obstruction, it was dangerous intentional sabotage, and I contacted the police immediately, and this time the response was different, because evidence changes everything, and an officer arrived, reviewed the footage, and called a supervisor, and within an hour Karen was being interviewed, and the neighbors watched from their windows as she stood pale and defensive, trying to explain away something that could not be explained, and when the officer left, he informed me that charges were being considered for criminal mischief and reckless endangerment, and that a restraining order might be appropriate, and that night the neighborhood was quieter than it had been in weeks, because the tension had shifted from speculation to reality, and Karen did not appear outside the next day, and the day after that the HOA sent a formal notice apologizing for the situation and confirming that the driveway was outside their jurisdiction, and that no further action would be taken, and while the apology felt overdue, it also felt hollow, because damage had already been done, and the story had spread beyond our street and into the wider community, and people began to ask questions about Karen's role in the HOA and her history of enforcement and complaints, and as those questions circulated, the board scheduled another meeting, this one closed door, and when the results were announced it became clear that Karen authority had been suspended pending investigation. And the shift was dramatic because the person who had once wielded a clipboard like a weapon was suddenly powerless, and I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness because this never had to go this far. And as I stood at the end of my driveway that evening looking at the gravel path that had sparked so much conflict, I understood that the fight was no longer about cones or ego, it was about accountability and safety, and the realization settled in that while I had defended my property, the true cost had been the exposure of how easily authority can be abused when unchecked and how quickly it collapses when confronted with truth and evidence. And as Chapter 5 closed, the outcome was becoming inevitable because Karen had crossed lines that could not be erased, and the consequences were no longer in my hands but in the hands of systems she had once believed she controlled. The investigation moved faster than I expected once official reports began stacking up because patterns are hard to ignore when they are documented clearly, and within days I was contacted by a city mediator assigned to review the complaints and footage, and she listened quietly, asked precise questions, and took detailed notes, and what struck me most was how unsurprised she seemed because she told me calmly that this was not the first time she had seen a situation where a self-appointed authority figure crossed lines under the banner of community order, and that statement alone made me realize Karen's behavior was not unique, but her persistence had made it extreme. And while the process unfolded, Karen retreated from public view entirely. No clipboard, no porch patrol, no dramatic gestures, and the sudden absence felt strange, because for weeks her presence had been constant, like background noise you only notice when it stops. And neighbors began to talk openly now, comparing stories of warnings, threats and confrontations they had previously brushed off as minor annoyances, and those stories began to form a larger picture of someone who had treated the HOA not as a responsibility but as a personal tool. And the board faced mounting pressure because ignoring the issue was no longer an option. And during that time I received a notice confirming that a temporary restraining order had been granted, preventing Karen from approaching my property or communicating with me directly. And seeing that piece of paper was surreal because it marked a shift from informal conflict to formal consequence. And the first night after the order was served I slept better than I had in weeks, but the tension had not vanished, it had simply moved elsewhere. And the next development came when the HOA lawyer requested a final review meeting to resolve outstanding matters, and I attended with a sense of closure mixed with curiosity because I wanted to see how Karen would handle being confronted by process instead of people. And when she arrived she looked smaller, somehow stripped of the confidence that had once defined her movements, and she avoided eye contact, fidgeted with her hands, and spoke only when addressed. And the footage was reviewed again along with the toe attempt, the rope obstruction, the nail board, and the barrage of complaints, and the lawyer asked her directly whether she understood the seriousness of placing hazards on a driveway, and she answered quietly that she had been trying to enforce standards, and that answer fell flat because intention does not erase outcome. And the board chair stated that her actions had exposed the HOA to liability and damaged trust, and that disciplinary action would follow. And Karen began to cry, not loudly or dramatically, but in short, frustrated bursts that felt less like remorse and more like disbelief. And for the first time I felt a pang of sympathy because watching someone realize that their sense of control has evaporated is uncomfortable, even when they brought it on themselves. And yet that sympathy did not erase the memory of how close those actions came to causing harm. And when the meeting concluded, Karen was removed from her position permanently and barred from any enforcement role, and the HOA issued a formal retraction of all notices against my property and agreed to reimburse documented costs, including camera installation, legal consultations, and lost time. And while that resolution should have been satisfying, it felt heavy because it marked the end of something that had consumed the neighborhood and left scars that would take time to fade. And in the days that followed the atmosphere shifted again, conversations returned to normal rhythms, kids played outside without the undercurrent of tension, and neighbors waved without hesitation, and the absence of constant scrutiny felt like a weight lifted. And then one afternoon I received a call from a detective who informed me that charges related to the nail board incident were being considered and asked if I was willing to provide a statement, and I agreed because accountability requires participation, and during that interview I spoke calmly, factually, and without embellishment, and when it was over I felt a sense of finality because the matter had moved beyond personal resolution into the realm of public responsibility, and later that evening as I reviewed footage one last time I noticed something small, but telling because the last clip of Karen on camera showed her pausing at the edge of the driveway looking at the gravel path for several seconds before turning away, and in that moment she looked less like an antagonist and more like someone confronted by the consequences of unchecked obsession, and I did not feel victory, I felt relief and exhaustion, and a quiet hope that she would step back from the edge she had walked for so long, and as weeks passed without incident the driveway returned to being what it had always been, a simple path home, and my 4x4 once a symbol of defiance became just a vehicle again, and that normalization was perhaps the greatest victory because conflict thrives on attention and resolution starves it, and one evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the houses, I reflected on how easily small disputes can escalate when fueled by ego, and how quickly systems fail when individuals are allowed to operate without oversight, and I realized that the story was no longer about one person blocking a driveway with cones. It was about how communities must balance rules with reason and authority with accountability, and as Chapter 6 closed the outcome was clear, not in a dramatic explosion but in the quiet restoration of order, and the understanding that while my property had been defended the true lesson was learned by everyone watching, because power when misused eventually turns inward and collapses under its own weight, and the driveway that had once been a battleground now stood as a reminder that standing your ground with patience, evidence, and restraint can outlast even the loudest displays of entitlement. The weeks after the investigation felt strangely quiet, as if the neighborhood itself was catching its breath and learning how to exist without constant tension, and during that calm a different kind of attention began to surface because word of what had happened traveled beyond our street and into nearby communities, and people started stopping me at the grocery store or while walking dogs asking if I was the one with the driveway story, and I would nod politely and keep answers short because I never wanted this to become a spectacle, yet the truth had a way of spreading, especially when it served as a cautionary tale, and meanwhile the HOA scrambled to repair its image, issuing revised guidelines, transparency statements, and new oversight rules, and while those changes were overdue they also revealed how deeply Karen influence had shaped the organization, and neighbors who once avoided meetings now attended in record numbers, determined not to let power concentrate unchecked again, and I watched this shift with a mix of pride and disbelief, because the conflict that began with plastic cones had sparked a broader awakening, and one evening the HOA president came by personally to apologize again and explain the reforms, and while I appreciated the gesture, I told him calmly that systems only work when people are willing to challenge them respectfully and consistently, and he nodded and admitted they had failed to do that for a long time, and then came the update I had been expecting. Because the detective called to inform me that Karen had accepted a plea related to the driveway hazard incident avoiding trial, but resulting in fines, mandatory counseling, and a permanent record, and hearing that left me with a complicated mix of emotions because while accountability mattered it was hard not to think about how different things might have been if she had stepped back earlier and chosen dialogue over dominance, and shortly after that she moved out quietly, selling her house below market value and leaving without the dramatic exit many might have expected, and the day the moving truck came I watched from a distance as boxes were loaded and curtains removed, and she did not look toward my driveway once, and I wondered if she felt anger, regret, or simply exhaustion, and as her car disappeared down the street something shifted inside me, because closure does not always arrive with confrontation, sometimes it arrives with absence, and in the months that followed life returned to Routine. The driveway remained unobstructed. The cameras stayed up but captured nothing more than passing cars and seasonal changes, and the 4x4 became just another tool rather than a symbol, and neighbors who had once whispered now laughed together, sharing stories and building a sense of community that had been missing for years. And I realized that fear had been a quiet architect of our interactions, shaping behavior subtly, and when that fear lifted, space opened for genuine connection. And one afternoon a family moved into Karen's old house, and they introduced themselves, warmly apologizing for any inconvenience their move might cause, and I smiled and welcomed them, and felt a sense of renewal, because places are shaped by people, but they are not defined forever by those who misuse them. And occasionally someone would still ask if I regretted escalating things to the point they reached, and I always answered honestly that I regretted the necessity but not the outcome, because backing down would have taught a different lesson, one that entitlement thrives on. And as time passed, the story transformed from a source of tension into a shared reference point, a reminder of boundaries and the importance of standing firm without losing humanity. And I learned something about myself too, because patience had been my greatest weapon, not force, not volume, not intimidation, and watching Karen unravel had been less about defeating her and more about refusing to become what she expected. And one evening, as I drove down the driveway under a sky streaked with orange and purple, I thought about how fragile order can be when rules are enforced without wisdom, and how resilient it becomes when communities demand fairness and accountability. And the irony was not lost on me that the cones meant to block my path had instead cleared one for change. And while the conflict had been draining, it had also been clarifying, revealing who was willing to stand up, speak out, and listen. And as Chapter 7 settled into reflection rather than confrontation, I understood that the true resolution was not just Karen's departure or the legal outcomes, but the restoration of balance and trust, and the knowledge that when faced with unreasonable authority, it is possible to respond with calm evidence and persistence, and emerge without bitterness. And the driveway that once symbolized division now simply led home again, carrying with it the quiet lesson that ego may shout loudly, but truth endures patiently, and communities, when given the chance, can choose growth over fear and accountability over silence. And that understanding lingered as the sun dipped below the horizon and the streetlights flickered on, illuminating a neighborhood that finally felt like one again. The last piece of closure came quietly on a morning that felt ordinary, which somehow made it more meaningful, because there was no crowd, no clipboard, no raised voices, just the simple act of pulling out of my driveway without obstruction for the first time in months. And as the tires rolled over the gravel, I realized how much tension I had been carrying without noticing, because my shoulders relaxed and my breathing slowed, and the absence of resistance felt like freedom. And later that day I received a final letter from the HOA confirming the conclusion of all investigations, the implementation of new oversight policies, and a written acknowledgement that my driveway was private and permanently excluded from HOA jurisdiction. And I filed it away, knowing I would likely never need it, but also knowing the peace of mind it represented. And in the weeks that followed, life settled into patterns that had once seemed automatic. Neighbors waved without hesitation, kids biked freely, and the sound of laughter replaced the hush that had dominated the street. And I found myself reflecting on how easily a single person with unchecked authority can warp an entire environment, and how quickly that environment can heal once accountability is restored. And one afternoon, as I was cleaning out the garage, I found one of the orange cones that had been left behind unnoticed, and I picked it up, turning it over in my hand, surprised by how light it was, because it had felt so heavy at the time. And I set it aside, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of how small things can cast long shadows when fear gives them weight. And as months passed, I stopped checking the cameras regularly, and the driveway became just a driveway again, a path, not a symbol. And when winter came and snow dusted the gravel, I watched tire tracks appear and disappear without incident, and felt grateful for the simplicity of it all. And occasionally new neighbors would hear fragments of the story and ask politely, and I would share just enough to convey the lesson without reliving the conflict, because dwelling on it would give it power it no longer deserved. And the true ending arrived one evening, when I received a handwritten note forwarded from the detective who had handled the case, containing a brief apology from Karen acknowledging that she had let her role consume her judgment, and that while she could not undo what she had done, she hoped I could move forward without bitterness. And I read it twice sitting quietly, and I felt something unexpected, not anger, not triumph, but release, because forgiveness does not mean forgetting, it means choosing not to carry the weight anymore. And I did not respond, because closure does not always require conversation, and as the seasons turned I found myself appreciating the mundane details of home more, the sound of the gate, the crunch of gravel, the way the driveway curved, just enough to catch the light at sunset, and those small moments felt earned and meaningful because they had been defended with patience rather than force. And I realized that the 4x4 that had once symbolized defiance now represented resilience, a tool that had carried me through conflict without becoming the conflict itself. And one evening during a neighborhood gathering, someone joked about cones, and everyone laughed easily because time had softened the edges and transformed tension into shared memory, and I smiled knowing that humor was a sign of healing. And as I looked around at faces relaxed and open, I understood that the greatest victory was not seeing someone lose power, but watching a community reclaim its sense of fairness and trust. And in that moment the entire experience crystallized into a simple truth, that boundaries matter, not just physical ones like driveways, but ethical ones like respect and accountability. And when those boundaries are crossed, it is possible to restore them without losing humanity. And as Chapter 8 closed, not with drama but with quiet reflection, I felt content, knowing that the path in front of my home, once blocked by cones and ego, now led forward unobstructed, carrying with it a lesson that would endure longer than any conflict. Because while entitlement may attempt to stand in the way, patience, truth, and steady resolve will always find a way through. And the driveway, once at the center of chaos, had returned to what it was meant to be, a simple passage home, and in that simplicity lay the most satisfying ending of all.